Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with David. David, for everyone out there listening, please tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a history professor at Olney Central College in Olney, Illinois. For the past 20 years, I have taught a class on political assassinations of the 1960s, which is a pretty unique class. I think originally my administrators knew I'd spent a lot of time and gone to conferences and was involved with this story pretty heavily. And they said, well, why not make it into a class? I said, I'll give it a shot. And here we are 20 years later. I still teach this class. I think the college students find it fascinating. I think in some ways it's hard to engage a generation that wasn't alive at the time this sort of thing happened. But if you present the story and all the elements to it and the mystery to it, the injustice of it, I think it gets the attention of young people right away. They become engaged. And I think that's true for a lot of Americans. The reason why Americans still do not accept the Warren Commission version of history is that the facts simply present otherwise. Once you take the time to look at the facts, they don't add up to the story that we were given. And it ultimately leads to the idea that we haven't been told the truth by our institutions about this incredibly significant point in American history. And that's where the passion and the pursuit of that justice and truth comes in for me and for others. We seek that out. In more recent years, I've held conferences around the country. In fact, we're going to have another one in Dallas in November that we're putting together for some of the top experts to come and speak about not only the JFK assassination, but RFK, MLK, Malcolm X, because all those political murders in the 1960s had an enormous impact on the country and put us on a course that we haven't really self-corrected with yet. And that makes them still important, still relative. I understand it's difficult, for academics such as myself to how you might, enter into this area of conspiracy and controversy. I remember one fellow academic said this story is just too convoluted. Yet, at the end of the day, truth is truth, justice is justice, and it's easy to fall into the conspiracy, black hole, and obviously conspiracy theorists are not held in high, quote unquote, conspiracy theorists are not held in high regard these days. And obviously the level of disinformation and fantastical stuff that some people attach themselves to, I think it really muddies the waters, so to speak. Yet when there's a story where there are facts of conspiracy, overwhelming facts of conspiracy, which is what we have found in the case with the JFK assassination, that one must pursue it if you believe in justice, if you believe in truth. Let the facts stand where they were. If there was a conspiracy of powerful people that colluded against the president of the United States, who was challenging a power structure, then so be it. We need to know that story. We need to come to grips with that as a country, or we're not really complete, and we can't really call ourselves a true democracy when things like this are allowed to happen without any, as I keep coming back to, justice. So that's kind of where I've been at. I don't know if that gives you.
Yeah, it gives me a lot.
Story about where I'm at and what I gone through these past years.
When you mentioned in the beginning about kids being interested in something like this, I look at it like this is a very, very crucial thing when we talk about what's real and what's not real. And when we enter this territory, what gets labeled conspiracy, which I use the Richards example, which is you have to separate conspiracy, which is real legal language, compared to fantasy, which is what people relate those conspiracy theories to that what they are. And I go with conspiracies, especially if we look at like evidence or the idea of critical thinking, for instance, making a logical conclusion. It sounds crazy when you say the government took out JFK. But if you say it in a sense of that there was a government organizations that have been developing and going down a very dark route, which is how they preface it in Watergate when they talk about William Colby, where he exposed the evil, I guess, route that the CIA was heading in, that sounds more reasonable and it sounds more logical. So I don't know if it's the language that gets involved there, but when we talk about younger kids being involved into the assassination, this is where people like me, people who are around my age, who are interested in the subject try and look back on history, and what they do is they might get a falsified version of what that is, and that is anything that could be printed in the history textbooks. I have a different insight on the Bay of Pigs and Kennedy's link to that from talking to people like Larry Hancock and doing episodes and learning more about the information, where I realize that there's more than just he didn't send troops. There was a whole slew of things that was going on around that time, and I think this is what makes all these subjects really interesting, because when you're trying to find the information, memory is a fragile thing. And you, like you were saying off air, you got to be careful who you talk to. When you're talking to people, it doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter whatever. They can have their own story, but also memory is a very fragile thing. And next thing you know, with the amount of time, it's been 60 years since Kennedy's assassination. The fact that we haven't had an answer, or that we haven't had a official statement about the truth of whatever it is, and there's documents hidden, there's so much time in there where details could be added. Be like, oh, they already solved that, or they already solved that, or they already solved that. Well, where? Nobody shows you anything. So then there's still this mess of trying to get down to the answer and the truth, and whether the truth is dirty or not, I feel like it needs to be explained. So I'm very interested in the JFK topic. I'm just curious, when it comes to the Warren Commission, what did they get right? What did they get wrong? I can point to a lot of things they got wrong, but I don't. A lot of people always bring up the Warren Commission did a great job, and they might be lone nut people, the people that believe that theory, but I don't have no clue what they're pointing at.
I don't either. I mean, I'm not sure what anybody could suggest. I mean, even those that are skeptics about the Warren Commission oftentimes will use the fallback, the limited hangout, to use the CIA analogy that, well, they didn't do, if they messed certain things up, or they botched this, or they did this. But okay, but that's not what we're talking about here. I think ultimately, fundamentally, the Warren Commission was, I mean, appointed by Lyndon Johnson not to find out the truth. They were they were given a message to prove Oswald did it. I mean, it's the quotes. In fact, some of the quotes, that quote was always out there with Nick Katzenball, I think Assistant Secretary of Defense State, made the statement, the public must be satisfied that Oswald acted alone, had no Confederates. Well, some of the things, when we mentioned the new document, declassified documents that have come out that I mentioned, we find out that it wasn't just Katzenball that was making those statements. Hoover was making the statement. We know that some of Johnson's underlings, like Bill Moyers, were making those same statements. It was almost like group speak from the get-go, that this is where we are going with this story, and we're not allowed to go somewhere else. Now, some of those Warren Commission commissioners maybe weren't all bought into that. There's some guys there, obviously Richard Russell, Hale Boggs, were two of them that certainly did not buy in and became suspicious, that wanted to write an alternative report and were not allowed to, because they understood from what the information they had, it didn't add up either. But they were kind of silenced in all this. I mean, it was almost as if it was, who controlled the message. I mean, if you do a comparison, not to get too deep into politics, but like, we waited anxiously recently for 2 years on the Russia investigation and Mueller's report, and then And then it comes out, and Barr, the secretary of, or, obviously not, so attorney general, comes out and says, well, there's nothing to the story. And then you dig down into it later, and Mueller's got 10 counts of obstruction against the president of the United States, but that all got lost, because the story came out, the official verdict. And it's the same thing. I think there were individuals on the Warren Commission that knew that this was not right, but their voices were silenced. And once the media latched on to the Oswald acted alone story, you had a very different media in 1963 than you have today. And obviously, much more concentration. Now, there's a problem with the concentration of media today. Corporate media, they still project stories, sometimes not the correct ones, but we've got so many other avenues of information and disinformation out there today. Like social networks, podcasts, like we're doing here. I mean, that where folks get information, but the information was so much more controlled. You had the three major networks, Associated Press, Time Life. I mean, whatever came out of those few major newspapers, once they bought into the story that Oswald did it, and they're not going to roll back from that. Because it would involve enormous amounts of embarrassment, that they missed the ball, that they didn't bother to dig in. They didn't bother to read the 26 volumes before they latched on to the official, quote unquote, official story. And of course, the Warren Commission ignored a whole lot of folks and a lot of information as well. They they depended on the FBI to gather information. J. Edgar Hoover, who was, let's not even go there. I mean, what was looked at, what was not. They did not, by any stretch of the imagination, do a complete investigation. When they came on some things like Sylvia Odeo late in the process, who said that, made a comment that Oswald and Cubans came to see her, before the assassination, laying out, suspicious comments about Oswald, his connections and what he might do. The Warren Commission, some of those said, look, we're trying to close doors, not open them. So when they didn't want to deal with Odeo. That's just one example. That just shows you the direction. If you set out in a direction not to find the truth, but to prove something, which was their agenda, which was, Johnson fed Earl Warren a line of bull about, hey, World War III, if we don't shut this thing down, which is, I find to be an insane way to twisted logic to try to get folks to fall in line with a story. But we can't let the American public know what happened here. It's too dangerous. Well, what does that mean? I mean, here we are close to 60 years later, and we
Wait,
still
did
have
someone officially say that?
roll it back. That I'm sorry, you
Did
officially say.
that we can't let the America public know about this?
Yeah, I mean, there were not an official statement, but I think statements circulated the fact that Johnson kind of used that line to recruit people like Earl Warren, who didn't want, hey, the public, we can't let this, the stuff with the Russians, and if the public finds out it could be World War III, they kind of used that line and angle, in particular, meaning Johnson, to try to coerce particularly Earl Warren to be on the Warren Commission. No, I don't think there was a public statement to that effect, but those things have kind of come out of the woodwork, that that kind of agenda that that we, in order that there might be some connections with the Russians. If the public were to find this out, it might lead to nuclear war. So we have to suppress that line of thinking. And I find there's no truth in that, but it's a line to just simply force people on the inside to accept the company line, so to speak.
Well, the way I receive that is the same way. Like I look at it like they're just hopping on the war hype that's going on, the people's fear with Russia or nuclear destruction at the time. I mean, if you can trying to cover something up and you just use that to your advantage. So now
Yeah,
you're basically
exactly.
piggybacking it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when it comes to like Lyndon Johnson, do you think that he planned to have Kennedy assassinated? Because I look at it like I think he found out later what happened, like maybe not that long after he got into office, because he just seems like a guy who's very self-preserved. Like when you hear that call with J. Edgar Hoover and they're talking about the three bullets, yep, we have the three bullets and we got them. And he goes, was any of them fired at me? Like, I think there was probably some like I don't know, maybe I'm putting something into it, but I just look at like I definitely think he found out what happened, the truth. And then it was everything like we got to make sure this goes 100% this way. Like with the Warren Commission being attached, I always bring up the point of all the people that backed down from it, like that didn't like the direction it was going into. And I go, I mean, I don't know how much you're getting paid on the Warren Commission, but it's a gold star on your record when you could put on your resume that you investigated the assassination of a president. And the fact that someone was willing to put that away and be like, I don't want to be a part of this really strikes me as a sign of integrity.
Well, let's talk about Lyndon Johnson, because that is kind of a lightning rod in the JFK assassination community, whether folks want to go, quote unquote, go there or not. When we talk about Johnson, I think so most folks that embrace the idea of conspiracy in the first place, even that maybe look in other directions by Johnson, will admit that Johnson was, quote unquote, involved in the cover up. And there's no question. I mean, Johnson was, the suppression of evidence, the creation of the Warren Commission, which was a cover up, and all these things come into play here. That, yeah, but what was his motivation if he did this? I mean, if is the thing, when you look at Johnson, I'll say this, because I'm more in the camp that Johnson had more of a sinister role in this, because no one benefited more from the assassination than Lyndon Johnson. No one was in any better position to orchestrate the the things that happened on that day, including the autopsy, the cover up in terms of evidence, the control of the Secret Service, and then the control of the story after. I mean, the moment that JFK died, Lyndon Johnson had all the power in his hands to orchestrate a cover up. And let's face it, I mean, these are, if you just took this and said, stop promoting, not talk about Lyndon Johnson, the president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson who did this, Lyndon Johnson who did civil rights, Lyndon Johnson, this giant of a figure. But Lyndon Johnson was in enormous trouble leading up to the assassination. I mean, there were multiple scandals closing in on Lyndon Johnson. And many of those scandals were being investigated by Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General. And then, by every indication we've had, there's a Life magazine named James Wagenborg, who's with Life magazine, still alive, still speaks, said, hey, we were investigating Lyndon Johnson. Our mission was to end his political career, and the person who was feeding us all the information to get that done was Bobby Kennedy. So it's pretty obvious that the Kennedys wanted to get rid of Lyndon Johnson, and they would have if he'd been off the ticket or in jail because of scandals associated with Billy Saul Estes, uh, the Henry Marshall. I mean, there's just a whole string of things. Lyndon Johnson was probably as corrupt as any political individual before or after that I can know of. So if we take that all into account now, and his whole persona of enormous ambition, uh, narcissist, all those things that in terms of his personality and his position and what he stood to gain and what he stood to lose, it's really hard for me to just separate himself out and just say, hey, he's only involved in the cover up. Really? I mean, I just, do I think Johnson was a central planner in the assassination? Absolutely not. But did he have enough? Was he in the know? And was a willing collaborator? I tend to think, yeah, I do. I'm in that camp. I know a lot of folks are not, but that's one of the things we speculate about and still discuss. I think because Johnson's behavior before and after the assassination are incredibly suspicious. Let's just put it that way.
I think this is just because I maybe I don't have all the information on Johnson, but if you're going to be in on the assassination, I just wouldn't picture someone that cares about what 3 bullets were fired at JFK. Did any of them aimed at me? I just look at that like you wouldn't be riding behind JFK if you knew that there was an assassination plot to kill him that day. I just look at like I think he found out later, but I also think with all the scandals that he had,
Mhm.
someone probably offered him a lifeline out of it. We're going to make these go away, and then if you go by the ball that we play.
Yeah, I mean, whether that happened before or that's, but obviously that does think to play a role, because you were absolutely right, Robbie, that all those things did go away, and that to me that makes it more suspicious. I mean, there were those testifying against Johnson and his scandals the moment of the assassination. The Congress was holding hearings about Johnson's scandals with Bobby Baker and Billy Solestes, and those things just disappeared overnight. They disappeared with those bullets in Dallas. He had nothing to worry about after that. And his close friend J. Edgar Hoover, he could appoint him as a lifetime appointment, another person who enormously benefited from the assassination, because Hoover was going to be retired by the Kennedys, and all of a sudden Johnson brings him in and gives him a lifetime appointment. Really, I mean, just one of those things you have to look at. Now, your questions about Johnson and the statements he made where those bullets been. Here's the thing about Lyndon Johnson. Why do we have those statements? Because Lyndon Johnson put a taping system in the White House. We have those transcripts. And he was smart enough to know, that everything is on tape there's gonna be on the record. I just think that some of the statements he made, he was aware of the fact that, well, he himself was audio taping. I would think he would be careful about what you said if you know your everything you're saying is being documented. And obviously, it wasn't Richard Nixon that installed the White House taping system. It was Lyndon Johnson, and he created this record, I think, and he also had control of when it would and when it would not be audio tape, which Nixon made the mistake of not doing that, I think. But
Do we have any recordings of him like saying like because I would think with the 3 shot thing that I keep mentioning, I would think that if you knew you were being recorded or you weren't doing it for like your safety, for instance, if someone's trying to blackmail you, you have it on recording so you can.
right, right.
So I would just go to the fact of like if I would have heard in that recording instead of him worried about 3 shots at any of them fired at him, if he would have been like, "We're gonna get those bastards," or something where he was picking an individual or someone, maybe not claiming that he knew who that person was, but whoever did this is going to pay. That type of talk seems like talk you see like in movies and stuff when someone's about to go get revenge or wants to get to the bottom of it when they're the real person that's the crime person in the first place. I don't know. Like I said, I'm thinking about this stuff because like I said, there's so many things in this assassination that don't just stop there. They keep on lingering on. I mean, we're probably dealing with ramifications for a lot of that stuff today, an unchecked place of power in a lot of instances.
Yeah, I think you brought something up there that's important is, the things that happen after the assassination don't add up to what the logical things should have been. So let's just say if a head of state of any, can you, if you obviously there have been assassinations down throughout history. Uh, and well, we just had an assassination attempt on the Japanese prime minister, whether he even makes it or not. Obviously, the Japanese prime minister was just shot. So, what is it? What should have been the reaction, or the reaction typically down throughout history, is if you're going to go to the ends of the earth to find out what happened, who did it, who was behind it. Not all this shrouded in mystery, and we don't want to know. I mean, the public can't know. You know, as Dr. Cyril Wecht, I remember him speaking at one of my events, a famous medical pathologist made a point like, if things were really above board, why didn't Johnson have the Kremlin on board or on the phone within an hour saying, "Did you guys do it? What's going on?" I mean, but why did Johnson hang around in Dallas for hours and didn't even bother to leave? What does the Secret Service do when there's any kind of attack against any individual? They sequester the president, right? Was Johnson sequestered? Was Johnson taken back to Washington? Hell no. He hung around for hours until he put JFK's body on Air Force One. There was no, I mean, Johnson made statements about, hey, were they out there after me or blah, blah, blah. But did he act like, did he or the Secret Service act like that he was in any danger? Why did the United States government not publicly go to the ends of the earth to find out what the truth was instead of go into a kind of a cloaking mode of and shrouding it in mystery of what happened? I mean, the reaction immediately after the assassination was, to understate it, atypical of what should have happened when we see things like that happen, down throughout history. And again, just to make another note here, because I like the history. I mean, let's go back to the Roman Empire. They went through the period called the period of imperial crisis over I think like a 2-year period, or 26-year period, excuse me. There were like 50 coups d'etats and assassinations of Roman emperors. It was like a turnstile. I mean, of these things happening over and over again. And if we go back in that history and we look at those, how often they happen, would there ever be a time where you would make the presumption that the person that succeeded the assassination or the coup was not involved in any way? I mean, if you believe there is a conspiracy, that wasn't the act of a lone nut, yet you want to try to separate out those that most benefited from it, would you do that if you looked at the Roman Empire? No, you would expect the successor would have been involved in the plot, and somehow that would be an automatic presumption. That's why coup d'etats happen. Somebody else ascends to power. So if we look at it from the sense of a pure coup d'etat, you have to look at who benefited the most. And there were others, a lot of folks that benefited from the assassination. Obviously individuals that wanted to change American foreign policy in Vietnam, and in terms of the CIA, who was going to be scattered into 1,000 pieces if JFK remained in office. A lot of folks benefited from this, and does that make them complicit? Well, it makes them suspicious, doesn't it? That's how I would say it.
When with Katzenbach, did you notice when he was he appointed by J. Edgar? Was he not J. Edgar? Was he appointed by Lyndon Johnson at any point? I know he was running the Central Intelligence.
He was an individual that was in the Kennedy White House and just continued on with Johnson. He was there before Johnson became president.
Is there any speculation about his role and everything? Because I remember there's a photo of J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Johnson at a podium, and there's maybe it's a bad camera angle, I don't know, but you see Katzenbach, he's like staring at J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Johnson. It's in Oliver's film, with yeah, that's a weird photo, man.
I don't see, and others might disagree. I don't see Katzenbach as an active participant in what happened in Dallas. I think was a willing soldier. He's told, again, this, you get this, and this is, and as I mentioned, it comes out in the new documents, that when multiple people are saying the same thing, it's, how can you characterize it? The company line, or I use the term group speak, or the narrative that the White House was projecting. Well, that happens all the time. I mean, in 2022, the White House will project a narrative, then all their spokesmen will come out and be saying the same things. Or if you go on talk shows, go before the press, you'll hear the same slogans, the same repeated statements. I think that's what was permeating throughout the White House immediately after JFK was shot, that the public must be satisfied that Oswald acted alone. But at the same time, maybe the most important document that has ever, I told you I've covered the documents, but maybe the most important document that's ever come out documents that associated with the government or anyone else actually comes from the Johnson Library that was actually exposed in 1993. And it's a conversation uh, after the assassination and before Lee Harvey Oswald has been shot. And Johnson and Hoover are going back and forth. And again, you have to wonder what they really knew. But Hoover's telling Johnson, "This is look, the guy we have in custody is not the same person that was down in Mexico City. They're different in appearance. They're different in their voice. It appears that somebody else was impersonating Oswald in Mexico City." So so again, Robbie, in a normal world, in a if we look at a rational way in which a government should react if what their head of state had been murdered, wouldn't that have sent out the alarm bells like, no, this guy's not a lone nut. If somebody's impersonating, if there are intelligence apparatuses impersonating Oswald in Mexico City 2 months before the assassination, something is rotten here. Something's going on. But that's not how Johnson and Hoover reacted. They did just the opposite. They said the public must be satisfied that Oswald acted alone. At the very same time, they knew somebody was doing something to set up Oswald in Mexico City. That tells you right there that the cover up was in place within hours of the assassination.
So J. Edgar Hoover wasn't involved in the assassination, you don't think?
Hoover,
Because
I
why
don't.
would he admit to Oswald that not being Oswald? I would feel like that would just prove even more that, oh, he's
Yeah,
in
well,
Mexico City.
again, this conversation that's going on between Hoover and Oswald, I don't think Hoover and Johnson is not privy to anybody else. Again, these guys are having this discussion. I tend to think that Hoover certainly did a lot to cover up the assassination. Now, what was his agenda? Do I think he planned in the participation of it? No. But with Hoover, what went on in the United States that Hoover did not know about? I mean, he had this tentacles of intelligence in America, all over the world. Every one of his agents were reporting back to him on anything. I mean, he ruled the agency with an iron hand. With Hoover, again, I'm not prepared to say that Hoover was an active participant in all this, but he certainly was willing to engage immediately in a cover up. And you got to ask the question, why? Why is he doing that? Why is he trying to close this thing down from day one? Maybe we won't ever know the answer, but he certainly was very active in the cover up, and that makes him complicit.
Have you found anything in the more recent declassified documents that have been at least interesting to you? Maybe not interesting, like on a broad scale of like, oh, this is going to expose this, but more just that you find interesting?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that I think what we've seen is with the declassified documents, and again, there's still that knowledge that there are still thousands that have been held back. That the CIA, if you look at this story go back to 2017. Obviously, I know maybe you're aware of the fact that a 25-year clock was running out. The Assassinations Record Review Board in the 90s was created to review all documents. They released some, but they allowed the intelligence agencies to conceal other things, but they put a 25-year clock on hey, at the end of 25 years, unless the president of the United States steps in, these things should all be released to the public. You got close to that timeline, and I think a kind of reality kind of set in with the intelligence community in 2017. Now, a lot of folks look at the CIA with suspicions right up into this day. I'm not sure that the CIA of 2022 is the cutthroat assassination operation at some levels that it was operating in 1963, but yet I still think they have an agenda to cover up their past, the so-called family jewels, if you so to speak, to use the CIA quote there. And so when it became apparent that President Trump was going down this road about, hey, we're just going to let it all go. I mean, they made a last minute rush, and they got some of the old guard to come in, like Henry Kissinger, people like that, to twist Trump's arm and say this could be do quote unquote irreversible harm to national security. Really? I mean, 55 years down the road, what could possibly be in those documents that could damage America's national security in 2022? National embarrassment, maybe, or agencies that might be complicit in the death of a president, maybe, but a threat to national security, well, that they managed to convince Trump that was the case. So what you got is more of a limited release. More documents have been released and has been rolling through about 3 or 4 different release points, but still things held back, things still redacted, documents still having, redactions on them. But even still, some very significant stuff has come out. I think it's important if we're willing to dig down into it. I think that they some cases the documents provide a narrative. Now, one of the areas I've been looking at is some of the most suspicious folks in the Central Intelligence Agency and their personnel files. That's what I've spent a lot of time on, like William Harvey, E. Howard Hunt, David Atlee Phillips, Dave Morales. I mean, you're almost talking about an all-star team there of individuals that seem to be part of this assassination story. And when you dig into those personnel files and some of their things and activities, in fact, not just looking at the classified documents which we have access to here at Olney Central College through the National Archives, we also did a Freedom of Information Act request about 4 years ago. It took about a year on particularly Hunt and William Harvey, and it took about a year. But the CIA, all of a sudden, I get something in the mail, this giant package of 400 documents that the CIA copied and sent to us on Hunt and Harvey. Some very interesting stuff. I mean, you get a picture, okay? With Harvey, you get a picture of someone who's really the perfect profile of somebody who could have helped carry out, participate in an assassination just because of his character, his extremism.
Could you elaborate on some of that? So I don't know who Harvey is. I know a little bit about Hunt from I think
Yeah,
he made a video for his son or something like that on his deathbed when he was dying of cancer, and
yeah.
kind
Hunt
of talked about a
made
lot of stuff.
some statements that are pretty amazing before his death, but William Harvey was kind of considered to be a real life James Bond of his era. I mean, he was a reckless jack of all trades in the CIA. He had kind of a cowboy mentality. Before he had a falling out with the Kennedy administration, he showed up at the White House with a pistol on his wrapped around his waist, like a
Cowboy.
Marshall Dillon type thing. I mean, he was considered to be a guy that was an excellent officer in the CIA. Yet he was all, but this personnel file basically said he was willing to move on beyond even the ideas of a superior officer. A nice way is the CIA admitted even that Harvey was willing to go rogue. He mentions that he had a group of officers loyal only to him. Again, something, and he had capability. He involved in activities that even they would not speak of in some of the documents. He was engaged with Johnny Roselli. He ran Johnny Roselli. He was this liaison between the mob and the CIA and the government. And it's interesting. Roselli, interesting character. All of a sudden, movies been made about, as a mobster, Hollywood mobster. There's a document in there about John Roselli, a chronology of his relationship with the CIA. Now, that in itself, the CIA's willingness to interact with and engage with what they call gangster type individuals. That tells you where the CIA was at in 1963 in terms of ethical behavior, nothing else. But Rose, they give this a detailed account of Roselli's activities, and then all of a sudden in 1962, William Harvey is put in as case officer. Then the documents say we don't know what happened next. Okay, like you're telling the whole story on this chronology of your connections with Roselli, but you do not know, or you do not want to talk about what Harvey and Roselli were up to after 1962, because there are two incredibly suspicious people there. Harvey had a huge amount of motivation because he was involved with the Cuba activities, and then the Kennedy administration shut those things down, and Harvey had an enormous contempt and hatred for the Kennedys. In fact, his wife, on a videotape done about 20 years ago before she died, said they thought that Harvey thought the Kennedys were quote unquote scum. I mean, so they had the motivation. And then once Harvey was exiled after he tried to orchestrate World War III and during the Cuban Missile Crisis and send his teams in there before war even started, he gets exiled outside the country to Madrid, which some folks think that's the exact areas where outside the country where planning for the assassination might have occurred. So, you know, there's interviews with Harvey in the new documents where they press him on assassinations. He said, look, if you're really going to carry out an assassination, you just need to pick out one guy who can do it all. Shoot the person, bury the body, tell no one. I mean, he knew about assassinations, he was involved with them. And so there's a lot there with Harvey that kind of paints a picture of the perfect profile of someone who would have been a participant, could have been a participant, and had the motivation to be a participant in the assassination of JFK.
Well, even when we talk about like where JFK was assassinated, I mean, they could have got him in his sleep if it was someone. This is the argument that people bring up. Like, if it was like the government that did it, or it was someone in the government, they could have easily had access and killed Kennedy in his sleep. And I go, well, it was a little bit more than that. It was kind of sending a message. I mean, you blow off the president's head on, a film that's now it might come out later, but it's shown to everybody basically on television and everything. That's
Broad daylight.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a scary thing.
Yeah, and I think some people believe that the perpetrators of this assassination knew exactly what they were doing in terms of, assassinating the president in broad daylight. If they can get to him, they can get to anybody. That kind of mentality about sending a statement. But it is important to note that there's strong evidence that Dallas was not the only place where they were stalking Kennedy.
Atlanta and Memphis, I think.
Miami and Chicago in particular. I mean, the Secret Service, I don't know if you want to say foiled an assassination plot or stumbled onto an assassination plot in Chicago that was very similar and very eerily similar with potential, patsies and the whole works. I'm not sure if the Secret Service, was, all on board with. They just, as I said, happened to almost stumble into this thing in Chicago, and then in Miami 5 days before the assassination, because of right wing. Basically, they had caught a right wing fanatic on audio tape discussing the assassination. They called off the parade route in Miami shortly before what happened in Dallas. So there's good evidence that Kennedy was being stalked. That wherever this is going to happen somewhere, we're putting ourselves in a position to do it. That this probably, what happened in Dallas wasn't a one-off. That there may have been other preparations to one way or another eliminate JFK.
When it comes to what should have happened, a lot of people bring up the point of the Secret Service should have all been fired because their job failed that day. What do you think about that?
Well, there's I don't know, you mentioned Vince Palomera. Are you aware of him?
Yeah, he's interviewed all the Secret Service members, even people who
Right.
aren't here
And,
anymore.
he has done an excellent job back in the 90s, before a lot of these folks were dead and gone. There's still one or two of them still alive, and putting these folks on record. And it's a pretty dark and amazing story that what may have gone on there. I mean, it's hard to ignore. I mean, you, you look at the ABC footage of the parade route. I don't know if you ever looked at that. It's on YouTube still, where the very black and white video done by a local ABC affiliate that shows at the beginning of the parade route, in car number 2, a Secret Service agent named Emory Roberts, who was kind of the head of the things on the ground there, got up at the start of the parade. Kennedy's car is in front, and orders agents, or at least one agent, off the car. And that agent, they have those running boards on the side of the car where ordinarily the agents would be. They were bracketed around JFK and some other parade routes previous to that, yet they were nowhere to be found on the car in Dallas, a known dangerous city. So an agent looks like he's going to get on the car, and it's obvious, and he gets off the car and looks at Roberts and raises his hand twice as to say, like, what the hell's going on? Why am I not on the car? That is incredibly suspicious when you've got agents, and you hear some of the surviving agents that make the statement, well, it was time for him to go to lunch. Come on, man. I mean, I can't buy that. I mean, it's 11 o'clock in the morning, and your job is to protect the life of the client, the president of the United States, and you're sending somebody to lunch. I don't buy that.
Do you remember the interview with Dulles, where he was sitting in there smoking a pipe, and they asked him a question about, have you ever done any violent acts in your life? And he kind of hits his pipe and he goes, no. And he does it like in this sarcastic kind of.
Yeah, I know that interview. Yeah.
That is, to me, that is like, oh man, this dude's evil as hell. I don't know if I'm putting my own perspective in that, but
you're not. You're right. You're exactly right.
And it's kind of like, look, I don't get, I understand people go like, the media dropped the ball on this, or the media was scared. I don't think that they were necessarily scared. I just think you got a lot more incentive to play ball with these people. I don't think it's out of a fear aspect, but you get witness testimonies, you get to interview private witnesses, people that probably wouldn't be giving interviews. But I still don't understand Time Life's magazine and why they're always pointed to and always this, like, how big was their influence?
Time Life was in 1963 was the most preeminent news outlet in America and in the world. I mean, I don't make a comparison because they probably they don't share the same they don't have the across the board reach maybe that Time Life did, but a similar thing would be like Fox News, because Fox News reaches more, whether you agree with what they're spewing out every day, but the reality is that Fox News reaches more people than anybody else. And in the same point in time, Time Life was the preeminent investigative body in 1963. And as I said before, they were after, not to hammer that point, they were after Lyndon Johnson. They had already, because of all those scandals surrounding, they had released a huge expose on Johnson shortly before the assassination. And the next series that was supposed to come out was really supposed to be a takedown of Johnson. And then again, they just back off to, because, hey, this guy's president of the United States. I don't think we can, I think Wagenfort, the guy Mr. quoted this, that we can't assassinate another president. So maybe the press became a willing participant in the cover-up, not wanting to make waves, getting the company line. And it's like you said, you want access, you play ball. I don't think it was necessarily, the media was complicit in the assassination, yet they're willing to accept and fall in line and tell this story. And then once this story becomes their mantra, it's hard to walk it back. It's hard for the media to admit, hey, we missed the boat in 1963. Yeah. Who's going to come out and say that? Yeah, CBS News blew it in 1963. Well, I got to tell you, CBS News did blow it in 1963. Yet you're not going to get some admission statement 50, 60 years down the road. I mean,
Well, we have Roger Feynman, I think it was, who was one of the lead tech guys on that network, who came out with a document. It's in the JFK Destiny Betrayed and Revisited. That talked about in their statement that they weren't going to go against the official report from the Warren Commission, and they highlighted in the film as well too, that official statement part. And he did do some testimony speaking about how there was no need to talk to any other things. They weren't going to go against the Warren report. They were getting exclusive interviews with witnesses. And I mean, I think that's pretty damning. I mean, I've never seen media fall in line in that aspect of things. I mean, we have our separate channels today, and I know you can't really relate today because we have so many channels out there now, but
yeah, it would be it would be much more difficult, as we mentioned earlier, to control the message today than it would be in 1963. Now, the problem is there's such a flood of disinformation out there, and so many, so much, such so many avenues of information, sometimes disinformation. Maybe it's even harder to get to the truth now because of that flow of disinformation than maybe 1963, but it was much easier to get these folks in line. And then there's a reality. It's simply the story known as Operation Mockingbird, where the Central Intelligence Agency had assets, hundreds of assets throughout the United States, inside the United States media that could project their company line, and did that became willing participants, willing assets, friendly assets. The CIA referred to them as that were projecting a positive image, and that, of course, anybody that was promoting the idea of conspiracy, well, they were the enemy. And early on, in particular, the CIA, Dulles and others were incredibly aggressive about going after anyone, anywhere that was trying to promote a lone nut story, and trying to disgrace them or come out with negative information. People like the early researchers like Mark Lane, people like that, some of the first books that came out, they tried to suppress. I mean, there was a really concerted effort on the part of the CIA behind the scenes, and using their assets inside the America's media to suppress the story, to belittle anybody who touched on conspiracy. The term conspiracy buffs is actually a quote that comes directly from the CIA. They told their assets, that, hey, these people, refer to them as conspiracy buffs, like there's some sort of, sideshow people in a basement. They're just, odd eccentrics that want to
tinfoil
dabble.
hat, tinfoil
Yeah,
hat.
yeah, the tinfoil hat people. I mean, tinfoil wasn't around yet, but that was coming. but to belittle anyone that might suggest conspiracy. So it wasn't just the Warren Commission that was engaged in a cover-up. The media kowtowed to this official story, and in some cases, the CIA even had assets to project false narratives and attack those that tried to go against the company line. I think that's the best way to project what was going on. And 56 years down the road, you still have that embarrassment, that probably keeps. And I think the media just, you'll still get some reporting on it, maybe sometimes objective, but they still have this demeaning, condescending attitude towards anybody that suggests conspiracy. It's still, it's the place, if you are a respectable journalist, that you don't want to go. And that's dangerous, because that means anything else that may have happened down the road, for instance, the assassinations of RFK and MLK. Well, you don't want to go, the investigation of RFK assassination, what came out there, we don't want another Dallas. What were they saying in 1968 after RFK assassination? They don't want another Dallas? What does that mean? They want it to happen again? No, they don't want the conspiracy theories to get out like they did last time. So there's going to be even more suppression of what might be the truth. Sometimes there there are plenty of conspiracies that are pure and baseless fantasies. Let's admit it. I don't buy into everything that goes flying around these days. But when you have the facts of conspiracy, that's always, I never mention the word conspiracy in the JFK assassination without saying the facts of conspiracy first. When you have the overwhelming facts on the ground, same day evidence, things that don't add up, single bullet nonsense theory. I mean, you you have the facts of conspiracy, you cannot ignore it. Whether you want to be considered a conspiracy buff or not, I mean, it is what it is. Reality is reality.
When it comes to the Assassination Review Board, what do you think about them? Like, I think that they started off really good, getting some really key evidence, but I also think with obviously the amount of evidence you do find in the beginning, there's a peak and then there's a drop off. And then as we see where we're kind of at today, I'm not saying they're not still doing work, but I just look at like they're past their deal. They're past their deal on when these records should be out, and they keep delaying it. And I just start speculating: is anybody in the Assassination Review Board, did they find out information what's still left to be released and figure that was too much for people to handle?
Well, they had, I think when I'm not saying I'm an expert on the review board. It's all its construction. I mean, you can look at the history of that. I think most of them on the board, and maybe not all of them, were interested in getting as much out as they could, but they also wanted to avoid making statements like one of the things the media like Time and others did, when they released their final report in 98, 99, Time Life came out, or Time magazine came out and said, the New York Times, others said, well, here we go. This proves once and for all, no conspiracy, because in the final report, the Assassination Review Board drew no conclusions. Well, that's because they were not charged with drawing conclusions. They were only charged and they stayed in their lane. Their job was to release as many documents as possible. They ran into a lot of resistance, particularly from the CIA and the FBI, in terms of what documents could and could not be released. And they really, what they had, what they got out of it, they got out of it. I think some of the members that are still around today are critical of the fact that, for one reason or another, the 25-year clock ran out. All that stuff should be in the public domain now, and it still isn't. It still isn't. And I think there is a national security apparatus that still operates in terms of trying to put up those roadblocks. And again, I think some of it particularly comes from the CIA in terms of not wanting to release what could be construed to be embarrassing documents. I think they got to Trump. I mean, Biden released another 1,000 back in November, but most of it was, I haven't been through all of that yet. I mean, most of it wasn't revelatory. It was just a little bit more. But some of the most sensitive documents associated with the JFK assassination are still being held in the National Archives. Why?
One thing I saw in the recent release of documents was there was a lot of people talking about how they misspelled Lee Harvey's name. They were talking about a different one, and I think it
Harvey
was,
Lee, Lee Harvey, yeah.
yeah, and there was Marina Oswald too. They kept getting, I don't know if it was Marina Oswald or Marina something else. There was a lady in there. They kept getting her name wrong. And there was a statement about that. And someone had wrote an article I read about that as well too, which I go, this is an important document. This isn't like you can rush you got a lunch appointment in 20 minutes you got to make. This is something where you're writing down a bunch of stuff and you're trying your best, which made it seem like there was so much of that lie being told down the line that eventually all the people that were writing documents on it. And it's much like academic articles today. Somebody publishes an academic article, they go around to 50, 60 something academics. Hey, can you put your name on this? Hey, can you sign this? So many people, I know so many academics who would sign something they necessarily didn't even read because of the person that was publishing that article. Where I go, if you have the Warren Commission coming out with, they need you to write a report about something. Well, it's like the storytelling effect. If I whisper in one person's ear and that message goes down 30 people, when does that message become clear? So maybe they got all the handwritten notes and everything, and some people couldn't read cursive that well and they misspelled whatever the thing was. It was like there was no general the more people, the better. Like more people that could agree with the official narrative, then that means it must be true. And that means the outliers were the conspiracy nuts. So then you have this a large amount of people, like the 70 something witnesses at Dealey Plaza, that randomly started having these deaths that started happening. I mean, there's things you can speculate where you start going, is this a conspiracy? Are these people crazy? Did they not remember because they were in so much trauma at the assassination? Or did somehow they got more people to agree with the official story and push that message to where now that's the majority, where in another dimension, another alternate timeline, it could have been the opposite way. If more people would have pushed the conspiracy angle or pushed that, we might have answers.
Well, to speak about, let's backtrack in terms of mistakes that might have made in the documents. Now, I don't, with the case of, I think one thing you might be bringing up is the fact that Oswald was sometimes mentioned as Harvey Lee Oswald in the declassified, or the files that declassified or not. And I think that may well have something to do not just with any kind of mistake, but that we know that there were impersonations of Oswald. There were multiple characters that probably used his identity. That there's might have been something a little more nefarious about the note, and without going too much depth to that, to the Harvey Lee versus the Lee Harvey thing. There might, that needs to be explored further, and I don't, maybe more time than what we have on this. But I hear what you're saying. The story can be, once it's circulated and refiltered over and over again. But the fact is, there were numbers of witnesses in Dealey Plaza that saw something entirely different than what the Warren Commission brought out as the official story. And some of those witnesses were badgered, ignored. And if you get down to the essence of this, okay, let's go back to Dealey Plaza. Let's do a couple core things here. In Dealey Plaza, there were most of the witnesses that were closest to the scene that actually saw JFK shot and had the best looks all believed shots came from the front. I mean, or most of them, like S.M. Holland, who was on the overpass, he had like he was in a theater watching a stage, definitively said, I saw shots from the grassy knoll, and I saw smoke coming from those trees. Newman, the former military guy, on the grass in front of the picket fence, saw shots coming over his head. Then you had Gene Hill on the other side of the street who just had a point blank view. So you can go through all those witnesses, and yet you still come out with this story, this narrative that's entirely different. Again, it just shows you the level potential of cover up that was going on, and that just can't be ignored. And I think
Well, like even with Richard, when Richard talked about the Zapruder film, when they brought him in to talk about the films that he took, they let him walk through his shots, but then they were like, and also we want you to say this as well too.
Yeah. And how did the whole story circulate? Where did the story of the so-called single bullet story come from? Well,
Spectre.
Obviously it came from a young junior counsel named Arlen Specter.
But a law degree.
Yeah, I mean, and let's, many people have spoken about this, but the fact was that there was no consensus on the Warren Commission within those commissioners that had anyone individually or as a group believe that story. They got to a point where they, this whole, this narrative about Oswald, originally the FBI simply had 3 shots. Okay, very simple, 3 shots. One that hit John Connally, one that hit Kennedy in the throat, and then one shot that took his head off. And that was in 3 shots. The time frame, the Zapruder film, the bullets found at the 6.4, nice and clean. And then James Tague comes along. James Tague is hit by a bullet fragment or a piece of cement flying from a bullet at the base of the street. It was documented by the police. They could not ignore the fact that this guy had very minor injury, but or injury at all, but he was hit. So they got a 4th bullet potentially, and that's where the whole thing comes of, well, rather than exploring the real story that, well, we got a conspiracy now, fellas. We got 4 shots. We got to start looking elsewhere. No, we got to make, we got to, Arlen, go in and watch the Zapruder film and figure out how you can make all this work with 3 shots. And that's what he did. He came up with this fantastical notion that one bullet could cause 7 wounds and 2 people come out clean and keep this thing suppressed, because now you got 1 shot that has to miss to hit James Tague at the base of the street. 2 shots have to cause all this damage. And there was no consensus in this story. It's just a story they had to latch on to in order to stick with the lone nut scenario. Back to what Katzenball and Hoover said, the public must be satisfied that Oswald acted alone. What, to me, the single bullet theory is the exemplification of that, that the public, we have to find a way to satisfy the public. And if the only way to do this is come up with this fantastical story that is defies rationality, that 1 bullet did all this damage and came out clean on a stretcher, then we'll do it. And I think that's the origination of the single bullet theory, which is still the linchpin of any Oswald alone story, yet still the weakest, most ridiculous form of evidence that anybody that spends any time looking at knows is a falsehood. That's why we're at the point where a majority of Americans don't embrace Oswald acting alone, because they've seen that stuff. They know there's enough Americans, even 60 years down the road, even the bombardment of lone nut scenarios, most Americans can still, do some logical, what you mentioned earlier, critical thinking about what's in front of them and say, you know what, doesn't add up, man. We haven't been told the truth. So
Well, there's red flags for me are red flags different for somebody else, I guess I would say. My red flag with Oswald was the fact that he did have intelligence blueprints or fingerprints on his profile. And at the same time, he's 24 years old and somehow was managed to slip a commission. I mean, in a sense, slipped in as in, I mean, yeah, he's not alive and they were pinning the murder on him. But in a sense, like all these things where Secret Service definitely should have caught that one man would be in this. I mean, they dropped a threat. What was it? There was a threat surveillance on him up to the last week before the assassination happened. Like that's already suspicious as hell. But then we get into a point of what's the opposite of Oswald? If Oswald's a 24-year-old who has a military profile, which would fit a description of he's a Cuban person or he's a Russian lover, whatever you want to say, if he fits this description of maybe our enemies getting this brainwashing onto whatever you dipped him, he's soaked in all this stuff, you have him be the assassin, then what's the opposite of that? Well, the opposite is you get a guy from law school, young guy who doesn't know much, who you can excel him and give him a bunch of money, who's more than happy to accept it. And then you have Arlen Specter. Like I have questions about Arlen Specter from a story I heard from a guest who wasn't even on to talk about JFK. He tells me off air, I didn't want to say this on air, but I used to work at a restaurant and Arlen Specter used to frequent this restaurant. And when he would come in, he would sit down and ask specifically for the same drink. It was a martini glass with 3 olives on a toothpick placed directly on top on one tray that he would have to walk over and place directly in front of them, not off to the side, directly in front of them. He had very specific weird shit where I go, that's when you start picking up signs of someone has like a power thing about them. They have some type of, they like to be like this hero in a sense. And if you're saying that you're now about to make the official statement of this theory, the magic bullet theory, that's going to clarify this assassination, and like I said, we said in the beginning, prevent us from going to war with Russia, then this is very important and you play a very crucial responsibility and we're going to pay you handsomely. So unless we can see receipts of anything that happened to Arlen Specter after that, or did you just take it from the fame aspect? He did the magic bullet theory, and at the time might have translated differently than what it is today, but at the time that was a congratulations, sir. Like the Warren Commission, I think a lot of eyes, definitely people didn't agree with it. I wonder if people in Texas felt differently about what the Warren Commission was doing. But I also think like with the amount of time that's passed with it too, with the amount that memory might be hazy, there's a lot of people that are lynched to this assassination thing for good reason, because the amount of trust in the Warren Commission and the amount of trust in the government from what has come out from now till back then has dropped. People don't have security in their government anymore because they're looking at all the stuff that necessarily was happening in the backworks that's now starting to become clean with more exposure.
Well, that's definitively true. I think you can I mean, it was much different in 1963 that Americans, a lot of Americans were willing to, my parents, for instance, they didn't, they were, they were, they accepted what the Warren Commission said. I always forget my dad making the comment about, well, if Gerald Ford says that's what happened, then that's what happened because Gerald Ford's a good man. Well,
He drives a
Gerald,
Ford.
yeah, but Gerald Ford, become president of the United States, was definitely J. Edgar Hoover's man on the Warren Commission. And no, I think Ford was among those that were most involved in the potential cover up. That now maybe we don't just have this blind trust towards our politicians anymore, that they're going to tell us the truth. I think that the JFK assassination, uh, the war in Vietnam, the assassinations of King and RFK without getting any good resolutions there either, and then Watergate, all these things just kind of created a level of distrust between a disconnect between the American people and their institutions, and that in many cases still is there today. That now, in some respects, though, is that somewhat healthy? I think in retrospect, if you take the opposite viewpoint, is maybe Americans in 1963 were too naive, too trusting of their institutions. I think we can have a balance there. I think we have to hold our institution account and realize that institutions are made up by human beings. Human beings have frailties and imperfections. If we don't shed light on them, if we don't hold them into account, there'll be a propensity to do evil or criminal or corrupt things if they're not held in check. That we have to have this. We want to believe in our institutions. We want to have confidence in them. But if we don't hold them to account, it's back to the thing I keep coming back to when I every time I ever think about the JFK assassination in the last 25, 30 years I've been engaged in this, I keep thinking of justice. If we don't find justice here or somewhere else, democracy is a harder thing. If we want to say we have some semblance of democracy, and we can debate that or not, democracy depends on openness and truth and justice. You want to live in an authoritarian regime with fascist tendencies where nobody has no accountability to tell the truth, then yeah, go ahead. That's easy. H.L. Mencken, the 20th century author, once said that early 20th century said, injustice is relatively easy. What stings is justice. It's harder. We if we're going to continue this 245-year constitutional democratic experience in America, we have to get to some level of justice and truth in things like these, or we're just going down the path of destruction. That's how I see it.
It's also the evolution. When we talk about the CIA from back then is not probably the CIA of now, I go, yeah, their tactics probably have evolved. Because in a sense, with that assassination, if you say the government did have a part in that, you go, then their methods just evolved. And that's where we land today, where I always bring up the point with like Marilyn Monroe. Richard corrected me on it when it comes to slandering JFK to kind of hide the assassination. More people ask questions about JFK fooling around with other people and RFK fooling around with other people than they did about the actual death of JFK. That
And
ended
I
up
think you're right. That's a distraction. I think that's a deflection. I agree totally.
but I still use the same method of why I even thought that in the first place after seeing that Marilyn Monroe documentary is that what they would do now if they wanted to get someone out of office instead of worrying about assassinating him, it's not the same gritty CIA. They would just slander that person's character, a character assassination. We see that happen all the time on media. Randomly, someone is trending all over the place, all over social media, and a bunch of articles and a bunch of stuff comes out. We saw this happen with today's politics, Hunter Biden. The Trump's guy or whoever it was, is one of his people, was holding that information. It was plotted. They had a planned point to release it when it came up to the election things as a whole entire plot to do that. You start getting into this point is whether it's real or not. Nobody's debating that. What I'm debating on the fact of the way that it's being intended, the way that government works now, it's so much easier to slander a person's character and make people lose belief in you. It's always what I bring up with Clint Hill. Like whenever I see Clint Hill, there's people that agree with the Warren Commission that'll say Clint Hill's a conspiracy and all this type of stuff. But then there's like what he's saying is like, why haven't they silenced him if he's saying the truth? And I go, the same reason they haven't silenced Alex Jones. They've made him crazy in the eyes of the public, and that's through media distortion. Now, you can say Alex Jones is crazy. I'm not defending Alex Jones. But what I'm saying is the tactics that they use. If you don't agree with the narrative, if you disagree or you say something that doesn't fit their thing, they're either not going to talk about you or they're going to find a way to hurt your career. And it's like getting blacklisted in Hollywood. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I think the maybe the assassination as a tool isn't as necessary anymore because it's easier to just assassinate someone's character. I think is what you're trying to say. There was so many media outlets and so much social networks. It's easy to go after from that respect. And Congress, obviously the CIA engaged. We can sit here and speculate and say, the CIA had a participation in the assassination of JFK. Yet, that's our institutions have not accepted that idea. Yet, you can say that. Yet at the end of the day, I think in we know that the CIA participated in factually multiple assassination attempts. That's on the public record after the Church Commission. They went after
693 on Castro, 693 planned attempts.
Multiple attempts on Castro. I mean, the successes in Chile, with Allende, Guatemala, those places where they succeeded in taking out coups d'etats and or assassinations. And then Congress passed legislation where, it's at least supposed to be, that it's no American institutions will engage in the assassinations of foreign leaders. They actually, during the Bush years, actually had to pass legislation saying, and I think that maybe in some respects brought enough light on that ultimately the evolution of the CIA to where the point is, where is it at today? Well, they engage a lot of secret activities. I'm not sure where they have the so-called executive action capability they may have had in 1963. I think that's the best, my approach. Now, some people might disagree, but some people might think that the government's still bumping off people somewhere or someplace. I'm not going that route at this point in time.
I do a little bit only when I see an article trending about Ghislaine Maxwell being on suicide watch. I'm like, come on, you're getting me. What are you
That
warning
whole
me
thing
about?
was a little, that and Epstein's death, like what went on there? Yeah, I think that needs to be explored. And he's in a federal. The guy was in a federal institution,
And allowed to leave 6 days out of the week. He only had to be there one.
and then all of a sudden the videotape thing didn't work at the time. Or their surveillance, the guys went to sleep or something.
Look, this is where I bring up the example of I get the people that want to believe the official report, because if you find out that this is all like real shit, that is very, very fragile for a lot of people, where I feel like their minds would just melt. It's like it's hard to think this type of stuff. And I just go, I think the government needs to have secrets. I 100% agree with that. But I don't think their line is correct on what they think might be too much for the public. I think if you want to know and you're willing to accept the risk of that, then you should be able to get the information. But I think we talk about the assassination and everything and how it's been so long and how we're not getting answers, and this is kind of bad for democracy. I don't necessarily blame a political party. I blame the fact that this is government and we're on a bad path. It's not just I don't think the president, in my opinion, doesn't have power. I think they can make really common in front of us type examples, but I think that there's a system in place, and we have a really weird government that's linked in with business. It's linked in with media. It's linked in with so much stuff where I go, there needs to be a separation in some aspects, but Even when I talk to Larry Hancock and he's looking through documents and he starts talking about the Bay of Pigs, if you hear about the number of things that the CIA did with the Bay of Pigs, the number of vehicles they had over there, the number of just, I mean, how connected they were in there before they even came. Kennedy inherited a lot of problems. And one of the reasons people bring it to the example of why they might have gotten rid of Kennedy was they wasn't agreeing with what they were used to hearing yes to. And I go, if you're, and we see this with Watergate, you see this with William Colby exposing it. They were headed down a dark path. And when someone spoke up after William Colby left, he's 76 years old, goes kayaking in the middle of the night and found dead a couple days later. His house was unlocked.
That
You're
was a little bit weird. Yeah.
like his house was unlocked and he's worked in the CIA for 12 years. Like these are things where people would say that's a conspiracy. But I start going, well, just look at the weird things around the case. Like that's to me, that's like those are red flags things, and any police investigator is going to look at that. It's the same reason when I started finding out how much the mafia was connected in the CIA. I go, how many suicide attempts happened of people jumping off buildings? Just in that time period of that, you don't have to take the assassination, but just in that time period. And if I had someone tell me, well, there was a lot of people that would like jump off, not a lot, but there was a few cases where people were jumping off buildings and killing themselves. And I go, did they land head first? Well, a couple people landed head first. It's physically impossible. And this is how police people detect if it's a suicide or if it's a murder, is if they land head first. Your body is like a cat where you land on your feet. It doesn't work that way, but your natural instinct, you'll turn yourself to make sure you don't land on your face. That's how they tell if people jumped off a roof because they were on drugs. It's how they tell if people were killed themselves. It's how they tell if people were murdered. That's a common thing. We know mafia people throwing people off roofs and stuff. Now, I know I'm going on like a little bit of a rant, but there's red flags in a normal police investigation. And I know a lot about this because I've talked to people who were on the Justice Project, you know, the Innocence Project, the people that get people wrongfully out of prison that were
Right.
wrongfully
Yeah.
convicted. They've exposed a lot like blood splatter analysis. All this stuff is fake. Gary Aguilar talking about neutron activation, whatever, fake. Like there's stuff that sounds good on paper, but when you really dive into the science of it, it doesn't make sense. And in a normal police investigation, if you're talking about the number of witnesses that were killed, there's red flags that they would have questioned in a normal investigation. The Warren Commission, their investigation, there's things you can question. There's red flags that are raised. That's not conspiracy. That is real. That's not it is conspiracy. It's not fantasy.
Right. Well, there's a couple points there I'd like to follow up on. Like number one, and I've told this to audiences before. I always tell this story. It was an intriguing story. When I was a few years back, I was giving a speech in the theater on my college campus about just an overview of the Kennedy assassination. And someone sitting in the audience was a chemistry teacher at that time on our campus, who was also happened to be a ballistics expert. She happened to work for the state Illinois State Police before her job as chemistry teacher. And I was going through some of the ballistic evidence, the medical evidence, you know, that's out there, you know, all this, the crazy stuff associated with the JFK assassination. Maybe you looked at some of that stuff too. And she just got up in the middle of my speech and goes, "What's going on here? Where's the FBI? Why haven't they gone after these people? This doesn't add." I go, "Look, what you have to understand, this is not a normal case." Exactly what you were saying. In a normal world, these red flags that you're talking about wouldn't add up. That people would have pursued these things to the end of the earth to get to the truth. But that's not the case with the JFK assassination. It's just a different world we're in. The reality is we're, whatever reasons, we have not been allowed to go down that road. We too many things institutionally have engaged or embraced the cover up to the point where no, we can't look at these things that don't add up, or we're not allowed to, because at the end of the day, if we really want a conclusion to this, which we all like now, hey, are people going to be arrested and prosecuted? No, it's too late for that. But if we need some historical and institutional validation of what happened in Dallas. I mean, a lot of folks say, well, where's the smoking gun? Well, there's been plenty of smoking guns. I mean, I mean, there's been evidence that's come out for the past 60 years that should not have been ignored already. We already have a good idea about what happened in Dallas. What we need some historical validation of what happened in Dallas and institutional validation. That's what we don't have. You still open up a textbook and you still can read about, do you really get the truth when a U.S. history student opens a textbook and and looks and sees, well, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in blah 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 6'4" school book depository. Well, that students are not getting the truth there or not. That's still where we're at. I mean, about the only place we get some level of truth is maybe in our minds. I mean, a higher truth exists in our own critical thinking, but are institutions going to react in a positive manner towards what happened in Dallas? Well, we're all pretty skeptical about that. But on the other hand, Robbie, I mean, this is important too, I think, is that if we could, I mean, there are incidences in history where we've corrected our history, then it's actually a good thing. I mean, a good example, Executive Order 9066, if you're aware of that. I mean, probably the most heinous thing the FDR administration did during World War II was execute an order to remove Japanese Americans from their homes and take away their livelihoods and put them in basically concentration camps for the duration of the war. It was American citizens were violated their constitutional rights. I mean, it was an injustice. But 30 years later, I mean, Congress, the President of the United States signed the Civil Rights Act in 1988, recognizing the injustice of it, giving the $30,000 a piece to Japanese Americans that lost their home property. Now, that doesn't change what happened, but at least we get to some level of recognition of, we cleanse ourselves of what happened in the past. And the JFK assassination, we have not done that. It's still I always say it's not unsolved. We already know a whole lot about what happened in Dallas. It's unresolved. That's where we're at in 2022. So
you'll have a lot of people that will be flippant and be angry, much like they were when people found out, I think in January, that George Washington's teeth weren't made of cherry wood, they were made of slave teeth. People flipped out over that. There was a lot of screaming and tweeting and everybody, it's a small scale thing, but people just, it's a shock to history and the way society is right now. There are some people that can handle the truth and there's some people that can't. It's that Jack Nicholson quote. But I think it can be properly done. And I think for the people that wish to know, they should be able to know. And I think it only really, once you understand that our government really isn't different than any other government. And I know people go, we have a democracy. That's true. Yes. But everything can lead to something else. And I think that starts with you, when you really want to start on the right path again, you have to start being transparent. You have to come clean with a lot of issues that people still have questions today. 9/11 is a giant one. The families want another investigation into that. And these are really important things where I go, you won't have doubt in your system if you tell people what they want to know. And necessarily if you think that they can't handle it, I mean, if they're willing to come up to the table and ask for it, at that point, it's just like, you don't want to repeat like an Area 51 situation where people were willing to storm a base and because they just wanted to know what was inside Area 51. I mean, that's what you get. You get this crazy scenario where people don't know what to do with their life and stuff. So I think it's important. I think people, especially the experts that have deserved in it, maybe they're waiting for you to get all the puzzle pieces together. Maybe if you get everything right, they'll tell you if it's true or not.
Well, it is. It's a situation where, we are still trying to piece together the puzzles that are out there that we, that I think that's kind of where JFK researchers are at today. That yes, we have a good idea of what happened in Dallas. I think we have a level of consensus, yet there are still some loose ends to be tied up at its most, when you look at the definition of conspiracy, it's probably hardest to to accomplish truth at its most highest levels of those people that may have, ultimately been the power players behind it. They may be the most hardest points in time to identify. And I understand that conspiracy is hard in itself to prove. I always talk about when we look at Dallas, a good starting point is to look at the Texas School Book Depository. If you really want to have an understanding of maybe who was behind this whole story and who benefited, who was complicit, even people that are skeptics look at say, well, if there was a conspiracy, then somebody had to put Oswald in that building, right? I mean, Oswald, if Oswald was a patsy, the conspirators had to get Lee Harvey Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository. How did that happen? Well, answer that question. Who hired Lee Harvey Oswald? Texas School Book Depository. Who owned it? D.H. Byrd. Who is D.H. Byrd? Well, if you want a map of different suspicious people and engagements, you only need to look at the connections that D.H. Byrd had and who owned that building. Well, he was a powerful Texas oil player in Dallas. He was connected to all the right-wing oil folks, the Sweet 8F group, these people that were all Kennedy haters and who saw potentially the end of the oil depletion allowance because of Kennedy. He was connected to Curtis LeMay, who was the biggest Kennedy hater in the United States military and, did some very suspicious things. At the time of the assassination, D.H. Byrd was hunting in Africa with Otto Skorzeny, a Nazi who was brought over by the intelligence community, who's, I'll tell you right now, is as suspicious as hell in all this. And then who was D.H. Byrd was a crony with Lyndon Johnson, a business association, and had a corrupt relationship with Johnson. I mean, on and on and on. So basically, if you look at the assassination from this standpoint, Lee Harvey Oswald is one degree of separation removed from all those people, because who hired him? D.H. Byrd. Who did D.H. Byrd know? All these people. What does that mean? I mean, if you want a starting point, all this, that's a good place to start, I think.
I got some research to be doing, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Where can people find you, David?
Well, I've got a website called JFK Historical Group that, as I said, we're promoting a new conference, and we've had multiple conferences over the years. There's information there, and I've written several articles in journals and so whatnot. Some of those are on there. Again, I work at a community college in Illinois, Olney Central College, and if anybody would like to email me, it's dentond@iecc.edu. I'm accessible, and I enjoy every opportunity to speak about this story and have for a long time. And, again, it's about justice. And hopefully at some point, those of us that have been on this thing for so long will see some of that. And that's what we all seek after.
Well, I'll make sure to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.